for every young person who wonders if God actually loves him or her, if God is really there, and how important it is to get past yourself to discover God, this 16th century pastor offers help. He was a tormented soul. Phrases like throwing inkwells at the devil because he felt distracted in his effort to serve God. That he eventually found a niche, a place for him to serve in quite a mighty way. A second fascinating person from church history, in the early church, Perpetua, in the story that bears her name, Perpetua and Felicitas. She was a young woman, a mother, and a daughter who was about to be thrown to wild beasts and the amphitheater of Carthage. And it seems simply because she was a Christian. This writing is partially her journal and partially the testimony of another who was on the fringe of the event. You see her trust God, even when her dad says, "Deny Christ and stay alive to raise your baby." Perpetua refused, and she instead stayed faithful publicly to Christ, and God strengthened her faith and showed her his strength in her life. Eventually, she lost her life, but not after influencing a lot of people along the way. So from Martin Luther to Perpetua, I think you have lots and lots of exciting stories, and I can give you another half dozen or another dozen. But these are stories of strong people with inadequacies that, they made it into the church history talk for today.
So I'm not surprised that you brought up Martin Luther. It seems like I heard someone say he didn't have a thought that he didn't write down. There's so much documentation from him. But he's such a colorful figure that, you mentioned about the throwing the inkwells. He also said a lot of things even more colorful than that you might be able to share publicly, especially with children. But just hearing the struggles, and I think that does make it so relatable. I imagine you're familiar with the church historian Carl Trueman.
Mm-hmm.
He said that being someone who teaches church history, you have to have a certain National Enquirer edge to your lectures to get people to listen. And I imagine you probably resonate with that. Some people approach it thinking, "Oh, this is dry and dusty and boring," but there's actually a lot of life to it.
Yeah, I think for Luther, he's appealing to the range of emotions. He's angry, he's bold, he's pronounced, select language for the Pope, including calling him the Antichrist. But at the same time, there's quite a bit of humility, and there is a brokenness, and there's inadequacies. And so at any given time in his life, everybody can relate to at least one emotion that they themselves often feel like they hate. Sometimes we hate ourselves because of how we act. And in the end, that's not what measures the contributions collectively, but rather it is what we were able to do when we were frustrated. And sometimes frustration is righteous. You think of righteous anger with Jesus, but Luther displays quite a bit of it. And sometimes we can say it's not righteous, but sometimes we say, you know what, he accomplished great things, and so I'm not going to measure him by his tone. I'm going to measure him by his heart and by his labor.
Yeah, that's great. So, yeah, and I think it's just so wonderful how he was so bold in that way. That you brought up Martin Luther versus John Calvin in some ways, and it's fascinating studying them historically. Such different temperaments and personality. I mean, John Calvin was a guy who, when he was brought back after being fired, just continued the sermon series he was in without even bringing it up. And Martin Luther's a guy that would never do that, and in some ways, God used him especially because of that.
Yes. Two different lessons for two different people in two different situations.
Yes. So obviously, church history by its definition is something that's in the past, but can it help us with the complexities of modern life? We face an array of challenges, and I've got some specifics in mind, but just generally, do you think it can deal with the complex issues we face just in the West today?
Absolutely. This is part of its instructional value from the two categories above. Your listeners are likely aware of how to apply the Bible for life situations, even though it was written at a different time. Without seeing church history, a book on it as Revelation, the same skills of lesson learning and wisdom, what to do and what not to do, for life application is contained there in church history. So, of course, it speaks to the complexities of the modern life.
So let's just throw a few examples your way. So how about technology?
Technology in church history often seems outdated to us, but it is there. Papyrus and parchment was innovative for the Apostle Paul to write letters, and because of the technology, it constructs scripture today. The papyri were as novel as the technology of Roman roads that allowed the gospel to travel on superhighways that it could not have done a century before. So technology is there. Some great successes of technology in church history is the invention of Gutenberg's movable type printing press. A little known fact, something like 90% of all works printed in Germany in the 16th century were by Martin Luther, the theological reformer. And that was because the printing press was just coming into its popularity. And they didn't have a lot of works because there weren't presses before. And so the values of a reforming church were perpetuated. In fact, in Germany, to inspire a new Lutheran church. Isaac Newton could identify gravity as a technology, but still realized that it was part of God's design in nature. Billy Graham used the radio to preach when churches were not engaging this technology in the mid-20th century. So those are some examples of relevance, but it didn't answer the question, Ben, of lessons. I think the lesson is that Christians can pursue knowledge, technology as a good thing, and it can honor God. Like anything else, it can be abused for a cause. It can be addictive or distracting from the cause. And like good stewards, we have to use the technology well in order to glorify God and to further the church.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. So how about the Christian, and then by extension, the church's involvement in culture and society? We live in a time of outrage and political disagreement, and we don't disagree well. How can we learn from the saints of old about how to live in a place that's ultimately not our home?
Even from the early church, Christians fell along two different lines of engaging culture. Some embraced and employed cultural values, thinking of Justin Martyr and Athenagoras. They used philosophical language and social norms and things people valued in culture to justify Christianity as culturally relevant. On the other hand, some Christians rejected cultural values. For example, Perpetua, we described, she refused to deny Christ under persecution and was willing to give her life as martyrdom. That's a rejection of the culture that is there. And there are several examples in history in which people did not embrace the cultural opportunity to their detriment, or they realized it was a compromise of the faith. And so in any given situation related to culture and society, a Christian has to decide what's best, what's appropriate, what's biblical. Maybe the best example of engaging culture is evangelicalism. It arose in the mid-20th century because the church felt like some fundamentalists were too opposed to cultural values that really maybe could have been neutral. They used the term holiness to reject movies and games. Well, these things don't define the gospel, so evangelicals accepted cultural values, such as Billy Graham using the radio, more to win the hearts on things that really mattered, as opposed to the things that were cultural. So I think sometimes cultural values are good, sometimes they're bad, and sometimes I think we can see them as neutral.
Okay. Yeah, that's good nuance. So how about just the family itself? We've seen a lot of decay and breakdown of the family, and we could just really expound on that. But how has the church before viewed the family as an institution from God?
Susanna Wesley comes to mind. She cultivated the faith of her children. I think there were 19 or 21 of them. And the effect was formative, at least on one or two of her children, particularly in the life of John Wesley. From this faith in the family, He started small groups, outside revivals, and there was a major revival within the Anglican Church of 18th century England. Meanwhile, John Wesley's wife was ready to string him up for always being itinerant, traveling around Europe preaching. He was away from home, away from the family. So an example of faith commitment in the family and faith commitment outside the family that might even compete with family, the complexity is there. Both speak towards a balance in family values, I think. We keep mentioning Luther. How can you avoid him? He wrote a treatise on teaching children in Sunday school to foster the training of youth within the church programs. I think one of the lessons for the family in church history, it's a hard lesson, but families have to remember that this is an institution that is not the ultimate expression of the gospel. Think of Jesus in Luke 14:26. If anyone comes to me and is not willing to leave father, mother, wife, children, brothers, and sisters, and even their own life, should not be my disciple. Family is a gift from God, and our children are also. We should show them the way of faith. But a family that serves outside the home or sacrifices to make their family less comfortable, this is a truer expression of the gospel than just the family for its own end.
So how about death itself as something, as a culture we're very uncomfortable with, and it's still considered taboo. We're searching for the fountain of youth and just approaching death.
Church history is not so different than contemporary church history in that death has never been a super popular topic, but in older days and other generations, they dealt with it more readily. And in that sense, there are lessons for us in their comfort, their willingness to confront and realize death. They provide healthy perspectives for us on this topic. When great people gave their lives, the martyrs Lawrence and Sebastian in the early church, they remind us that life is fleeting, but a reward awaits us in heaven. Church history can give us famous eulogies and words to say when someone needs comfort at the loss of a loved one. I'm thinking of the Reverend Michael Judge, his name was. He was the first person declared dead on 9/11. And at his funeral, I have it written here, it was spoken, in the next few weeks, we're going to have names added of people who are being brought out of that rubble. And Michael Judge is going to be on the other side of death to greet them instead of sending them there. He's going to take them by the arm and say, "Welcome, I want to take you to my Father." I'm thinking even tombstones in a graveyard walk with our kids, they have symbols, right? They show signs of faith, and they also help us to anticipate heaven on the other side.
I think that last part is especially so essential. And looking at, church, the focus on death in church history, because we really don't, even though we're Christians that believe in a kingdom beyond this life, I think our generation of Christians seldom focus on death. And you look at past Christians, the topic of death came up left and right. I'm a big Puritan fan, and it was like every other word was contemplating death. And that's why a lot of the old hymns, almost every old hymn, the last verse contemplated the impact of this theological truth upon our end to this life. Do you see any patterns that have been repeated in the church that could have possibly been prevented by paying attention to church history?
Human frailty. Leaders sometimes think themselves invincible, and they fall. The church takes sides on going to or abstaining from war. Both sides can claim God is on their side, and sometimes he is, and sometimes he's not, and sometimes he's on neither side. Lost causes. Movements believe that they are the revolution of God on earth. They might have success, and they might bring really good reform, and then they are defeated in their causes. These three in particular are kind of patterns that have a sad element to them in church history. They can have a very positive element. We do recognize that wars, as horrible as they are, that they might have good causes and they might have good results, and we want to call it good. And lost causes, sometimes we're glad that when they're lost, but we're a little bit different and maybe a little bit better even because of them. and then particularly leaders in human frailty. There are so many stories of fallen